Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Bus Stops, Access and Equity. My name is Brendan Williams. I'm the Research Program Administrator at Portland State University's Transportation, Research, and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, one of 7 national university transportation centers funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. NITC's consortium members are the University of Utah, the University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and Oregon Institute of Technology. Our presenter, Keith Bartholomew, is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the University of Utah's College of Architecture and Planning, and a professor of city and metropolitan planning. He teaches and conducts research on integrated land use transportation, scenario analysis, pedestrian-oriented design, and land use law. Keith is also the University of Utah's representative on the NITC Executive Committee. Our upcoming transportation seminars, they're held on Friday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. This Friday, November 13th, we have Nicotrus Perkins from the Oregon Department of Transportation will present on curating equitable transportation. Next Friday, November 20th, Mike Dolan Fliss from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill will present on racial disparities in traffic enforcement. Our next webinar is Tuesday, January 19th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Reed Ewing from the University of Utah will present on transportation benefits of polycentric urban form. On February 9th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, Li-Meng Wang from Portland State University will present land use and transportation policies for a sustainable future. Please note this webinar has been rescheduled from December 11th. If you've already registered for this webinar, you're automatically registered for the February 9th webinar. Okay, so the presentation is going to be about 40 minutes long. Then we're going to have 15 minutes to answer your questions. During the presentation, please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar control panel. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will be included in your post-webinar email. And with that, I'm going to change the presenter to Keith.
And are my slides showing? Can someone give me some response on that?
Yes.
Great, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. This is a lot of fun. I'm kind of used to just talking to the outside world through a little light at the top of my laptop. And so this feels entirely natural, at least almost natural as it could. But I want to welcome you, at least virtually, to Utah. Today's a beautiful day out there. We just gotten the winter's first major snowstorm. All the hills are covered with snow, even the rooftops down here in the valley. It's going to be a great ski season, and if you haven't sampled our snow, this might be the year to do it. And I don't work for the tourism agency, although you might think I do. What I do work for is the University of Utah College of Architecture and Planning, and as Brendan nicely mentioned in the intro, I am the Associate Dean of the college. I also teach in our City and Metropolitan Planning Department. And I want to introduce the team that produced the research I'm going to present today. Each of these members of the team brought incredible and unique intellectual skills to the team. And while I'm fairly sure that any of them could have done this project without me, I am quite certain that I could not have done this project without them. And when we get to our Q&A session, I'll warn you in advance, there might be some questions that I have to defer to some of my colleagues because we broke up the project into discrete pieces. Dr. Divya Chandrasekhar and Dr. Arlie Atkins are newly minted associate professors at the University of Utah and University of Arizona, respectively. Ja Young Kim and Samuel Jensen were the student researchers at those two institutions, and I want to note them for their hard work and incredible results that they achieved with this research, and also to alert you to watch for their names, because they are up-and-comers in the transportation industry and in transportation academia. Those are names you're going to see again. Also want to thank our funders, the Utah Department of Transportation, and of course, our host this morning, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. Also, I want to thank many others who have provided guidance and support along the way. Our academic departments, our peer reviewers of our research results, and the technical advisory committee members that guided us along the way. This is a research project on whether the nature of bus stop facilities matters. Instinctively, we know it does, based on our own experiences. Some have called waiting for transit the worst 10 minutes of their lives. Hyperbole aside, we live in an era of increased impatience and in a time with just-in-time delivery and Amazon Prime being indicators of how that is changing our world and our willingness to deal with the world's foibles. We on this study team wanted to find out whether our anecdotal perceptions translated to measurable alterations in demand for bus transit. Our first understanding is that bus stops are the points of first contact between transit services and their riders. Not this kind of first contact, more like this kind. Bus stops are the places where riders and potential riders experience the physical presence of the transit agency. And how the stop is kitted out tells the public two things about the transit agency. One, how the transit agency itself views the value of its own services, a self-image that they project, that the agency projects out, and that others will adopt. Two, the bus stop tells the value that the agency expresses or internalizes about the riders and potential riders who might use the service. Are the riders valued customers or barely tolerated nuisances? We live in an era of high sensitivity to customer service, and the stop is the first and sometimes only chance for transit agencies to project an image of valuing customers and potential customers. At a base level, how a bus stop is equipped is simply a measure of good manners and hospitality. Do you provide shelter from the elements and a place to sit to your valued guest or not? What messages do these stops project about the agency's self-image and their perceived value of their would-be customers? These stops all notoriously won Street Blog Awards for being the sorriest bus stops in America and North America. Compare that to this bus stop. What does this bus stop project? On a day like today, this is a bus stop I would want to use. Those seats are heated. We all want transit agencies looking after the comfort of our tushes, do we not? According to the Transit Center's 2016 National Onboard Rider Survey, current bus riders value having stops with shelters, not as much as service frequency, but a lot more than having free Wi-Fi. What this doesn't measure are the preferences or priorities of those non-riders who might become riders, those on the so-called transit bubble. Where the nature of bus stop facilities transcends base level comfort and enters a space of basic access and social justice is the effect of bus stop facilities on those with mobility-based disabilities. According to a 2013 Transit Cooperative Research Program, TCRP, study that was done by Thatcher and Ferris, many of those who report having disabilities that impact their mobility wish they could use regular scheduled service buses more than they currently do. This reflects the attitude of 28% of those surveyed who currently use only ADA paratransit currently, and 53% of those who currently use both ADA paratransit and regular bus service. What's the number one barrier to realizing their preferences? Barriers in the physical environment. Now, this includes many things, including lack of sidewalks, curb ramps, crosswalks, etc. But it also includes lack of adequate facilities at the stops. To investigate whether the nature of facilities at bus stops affects ridership, we began with an assessment of a single bus route in central Salt Lake County, Utah. This is the route, or a portion of the route, of the number 41 bus as it traverses west from the Mill Creek Light Rail Station. UTA, that's the Utah Transit Authority, upgraded most of the stops along this section of the route in 2014, taking them from a what we call pole in a puddle type of design on the left to a basically equipped stop with a shelter, bench, a trash can, and most importantly for ADA purposes, a concrete pad connected to a sidewalk network. We compared bus boardings at these stops, which we referred to as our treatment group, with boardings at other unimproved stops further out on the same bus line that we refer to as our control group. And we made the comparisons in two time periods, before and after the stop improvements for the treatment group stops. As you can see, boardings increased between the two time periods for both groups of stops. The boardings for the treatment group, however, increased nearly 3.5 times the rate of the control group. We made the same comparisons for ADA paratransit. For this comparison, we sorted geocoded ride pickup locations, selecting for analysis only those within 1/4 mile of both groups of stops. Here, you can see that the paratransit rides declined substantially, 9%, at the improved stops, or the areas near the improved stops, while they increased in the areas surrounding the control group stops. This suggests, does not prove, but suggests that at least some of the increased boardings we saw on regular service buses in the previous slide may have been coming from former ADA paratransit users who were switching modes from paratransit to regular service for at least some of their trips. There are, alas, at least two problems with these results. One, the analysis did not control for other possible factors that might influence ridership. And two, The control group increase of more than 28% in a single year for ADA paratransit that you see in this slide looked suspicious, like there were errors in the data. To remedy these limitations, we conducted first a matched pair analysis of Salt Lake County bus stops that controlled for possible confounding variables. And we found similar results to those that I just displayed in the previous slides. Boardings were up for regular service, and demand was down for ADA paratransit. We expanded that study to cover the entire UTA service area. This area includes more than 6,300 stops. A 2016 inventory showed that only approximately 7% of the total included the basic features of benches, shelters, and trash cans. The ADA design guidelines set standards for bus stop compliance with ADA accessibility mandates, focused primarily on the presence and characteristics of a hard surface pad connected to a sidewalk network. As of 2016, about 1/3 of UTA stops met these standards. For our analysis, we wanted to know, A, whether the addition of basic stop features, shelter, bench, trash can, concrete pad, to formerly unimproved stops was statistically associated with changes in boardings on regular service buses and pickups for ADA paratransit services. To address these questions, we made use of 4 sets of ridership data: bus boardings, paratransit pickups, bus ramp deployments, and the use of a special pass, the so-called Freedom Access Pass, which UTA provides only to riders who qualify for ADA paratransit. And by the way, they provide that pass for free at no cost to the user. The importance of the first 2 categories of data is obvious. The latter 2 categories were targeted at understanding whether we could observe possible mode shifts from ADA paratransit to regular service. We looked at ramp deployment data under the theory that stops with increased ridership from patrons with disabilities would likely see an increase in ramp deployments. And an earlier study of stop improvements in Portland suggested this. Using Freedom Access Pass data helped us to capture similar mode shifts, i.e. whether those who qualified for ADA paratransit service began using scheduled service buses more often after the stops near them had been improved. To control for possible confounding variables, we relied on a statistical technique widely used in social sciences and epidemiology, not as frequently used in planning regimes, although it is becoming more popular. It is called propensity score method. In brief terms, propensity scores combined weighted representations of all variables into a single number, which can then be plugged into a more customary regression equation. Our data sources included physical bus stop information, of course, demographic and built environment characteristics, and transit service and ridership data. We sorted the physical stop data into treatment and control groups using, for the former group, stops that UTA had improved over the 4 years of 2014, 15, 16, and 17. And for the latter group, all other stops that remained unimproved at the beginning of 2018. We excluded stops in rural areas, at rail stations, and along ski routes. Yes, I have mentioned this now, along ski routes because of expected ridership anomalies associated with these stops. This gave us a treatment group of 87 stops and a control group of more than 3,700 stops. If you know the Salt Lake region, you can see that the treatment group stops are clustered in the region's historic urban cores of Salt Lake City, Ogden, and Provo. We used existing literature on bus ridership to identify 27 control variables clustered into the general categories of socioeconomic conditions, land use characteristics, and regional accessibility. This slide provides a bit finer detail on our 4 transit-based data sets that I outlined previously. In this slide, we have our initial results. Here we see the results for bus boardings. There we go. Bus boardings and ADA paratransit pickup analyses, showing results both before and after the application of our propensity scores that we use to control for confounding variables. The highlighted row near the top shows the impact of stop improvement. For both bus boardings and paratransit, the variable goes from being not significant before propensity score weighting to being significant after the incorporation of propensity scores. For boardings, the association is positive, suggesting an increase in boardings being connected to stop improvement. On the other hand, for ADA paratransit, the association is negative, suggesting that improving stops results in reduced demand, furthering that hypothesis that perhaps improving stops can lead to mode shifts from ADA paratransit to scheduled service. Those inferences are supported further by these results. Here we see the results with ramp deployment and freedom access pass data sets. For simplicity, we include here just the results with the propensity scores already included. The results show statistically significant changes in both measures being connected to stop improvements. In both cases, the associations are positive, meaning that stop improvement is associated with deployments of ramps and the use of the passes. To get a sense of the magnitude of these associations, we looked at the average differences before improvement and after improvement for each stop, both with and without the application of the propensity score weights. The first data column shows the count data differences in the averages without propensity score weights. The second column shows the same information, but after the application of the propensity score weights. This shows us how much of the average change in value can be attributed to stop improvement. This is reflected in the percentage in the third column. And as you see, we do this for all 4 of our data sets, for ridership, paratransit ridership, ramp deployment, and freedom access pass use. Here's the same information provided graphically. So here are the results for just basic bus boardings on scheduled service buses. And you can see that when you compare the average improved stop with the average unimproved stop, you see an increase of over 1,400 boardings. And about half of that, 51%, we can, through these data, infer are sourced or caused or connected to, associated with the stop improvement. These results are take a little bit of thought to kind of work through, because what you have here is an average reduction in the improved versus unimproved stops for ADA paratransit pickup of just over 21 pickups per stop. Our improvement effect, however, suggests a decrease of 28%, or excuse me, 28 pickups. And so the effect of improvement seems to go even beyond the average difference in our stop types. What this says to us is that there are other factors in the data that are simultaneously leading to increases in ADA paratransit demand, and that the construction of stop improvements is counteracting those increases. More straightforward are the results that we see for both ramp deployment and for the use of freedom access passes. Here you see that, yes, there is a significant difference in ramp deployment that we can associate with the presence of an improved stop, but that the effect size is small. Only 11% of the change or the difference between the two sets of stops can be attributed to the presence of stop improvements. This makes intuitive sense to us because ramps, if you are a regular bus rider, you know that ramps get deployed for a lot of different reasons, not just for patrons with disabilities that require them to use a ramp. These data here are, I think, more convincing because here we see the use of the freedom access passes. And again, these are provided free of charge to the user, but only to patrons who have qualified for ADA paratransit use. They are TAP-based data, and so their reliability is, well, it's as strong as TAP data tends to be, but it's fairly good. And you can see that 40%, over 40% of the difference in change between improved and unimproved stops can be associated with the presence of an improved bus stop. There are a number of implications that flow from this research. One is fiscal. The costs of providing ADA paratransit service are high when compared to other types of transit service. And the Brookings Institution shows those costs are increasing in line with the aging of the nation's population. Nationally, Streets blog estimates that the cost per ride for paratransit at a bit more than $29 per ride. Locally, that figure is nearly twice as much. I know anecdotally that in some regions, for example in New York, the cost is well over $100 per ride. What our research suggests is that these costs might be reduced if transit agencies provided the basic features we measured and provided them more completely through their service areas. This naturally would free up resources to be used on improving other services such as regular service bus service. Oops, there we go. I believe I speak for our research team when I say that the more important implication of our findings is what investments in bus stops can mean for the accessibility such improvements can afford to individuals with disabilities. ADA paratransit is crucially important to providing such individuals with equitable access to opportunities and services. Paratransit's ability to provide that access, however, is limited by the price charged to its users, that's $4 per trip in Salt Lake, and by its point-to-point access characteristics. It is an out and back type of service that at least historically has required advanced scheduling. In our region, that has been 24 hours advanced scheduling. By providing users with better access to entire transit networks, bus stop improvements can open entire worlds for members of our communities who have been limited by the simple lack of a decent bus stop. The price for the facilities we researched in this study averaged $16,000 per stop, inclusive of right-of-way costs. That's not very much, considering the benefits that can be generated by such an investment. Granted, installing 6,000 of these stops, the amount roughly needed for 100% coverage in the Salt Lake region, would cost around $96 million, which are no small potatoes. Still, that's less than the average cost of constructing 1 mile of light rail, at least according to Bloomberg News. Here's a statement of our team's conclusions, which flow from what I've already presented. All I want to add here is the red line correction, or comment on the red line correction that I provided on this slide. When we started this work, we followed the standard practice of referring to the facilities we were studying as amenities. Given the apparent role these stop features can play in giving access to opportunities, we now see these features as important components in facilitating equity and social justice in our communities. As such, we believe that it is inappropriate to refer to them as mere amenities, a term that connotes things that are secondary, non-essential, or peripheral. Here is a list of some of the limitations inherent in our research project. We are eager to work with other researchers and practitioners to address these limitations and to expand the scope of the research. This photo poignantly illustrates one of our limitations. As you can see, there's a shelter, there's a bench, there is a trash can, and a concrete pad. And there is not a sidewalk anywhere in sight or a crosswalk. The nearest crosswalk is a half-mile away in either direction. Where is this stop located? Well, ironically, this stop is located directly across the street from the headquarters for the Utah Department of Transportation. And while that's a joke perhaps at UDOT's expense, I'm happy to report that UTA has just slated this street for the addition of a bus rapid transit line, the construction of which will solve many of the problems shown here. When I started this presentation, I noted that I am the Associate Dean for my college, and one of the obligations that I have in my portfolio is to recruit new students, especially for our graduate programs. And so I am legally obligated to put this slide in. I cannot finish this presentation without showing this slide to you, and suggest that if you're in the market for graduate education in planning or any of these topics, that you consider the University of Utah. Thank you very much, and I'm now quite pleased to be done early and to answer your questions.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Yeah, so please submit any questions you have. We have a few already submitted that we'll start with, but we do have time. So one of the earlier questions was getting at whether the service attributes like frequency, span, speed were constant.
They were within certain parameters, and how we controlled for that was admittedly indirectly. The MPO, the Wasatch Front Regional Council, measures accessibility to employment within certain time parameters, and they do that annually. And so we were able to put in accessibility measures that at least inferentially incorporated the attributes of transit services.
Nice, great. Okay, we have another question here. My screen's moving. How do we address the problem that it's often local or county governments that are responsible for building and maintaining bus stops?
Well, in presenting the slides this morning, I had to be careful not to include everything from our study. This has been work that we've been doing now for 4 years. And one of the things I didn't include, but is covered in the report that's available through the NITC website, are the results of a survey that our team members from University of Arizona did, looking at the guidelines that the leading 27 transit agencies across the country use for determining how and when and where to make improvements in bus stops. And one of the key features that comes up again and again and again is the kind of, I guess, balkanized arrangement that we have for the control of the space where bus stops are located. And sometimes that space is privately owned, sometimes it's controlled by the state DOT, sometimes by the municipality, and sometimes by the transit agency. And that makes it difficult to have a kind of a unified approach. I think where I would find inspiration here is with the MPOs across the country that focus and use some of their funds to try to incentivize improvements in livability measures. And so the Atlanta Regional Commission and their livability, I'm gonna mess up the name of their program, but they have a livable communities initiative that they have been funding now for decades, and they use that as a grant program to local governments and to service providers to make a whole bunch of different kinds of improvements. Also, the work done by the MPO in San Diego, their smart growth program has done a similar type of thing where they use small grant programs to some of their regional partners to make these kinds of kind of small scale infrastructure improvements. Those are the two places I get inspiration from.
Just to piggyback on what you're saying right now, we did get a question about whether you're aware of any grants or other funding sources for bus stop facilities. So you sort of talked about programs that are ongoing. Do you have any other ideas?
Those are I think, the most promising sources. I think departments of transportation, state departments of transportation are starting to get into this game as well. We've been pleased to see the DOT in our state moving aggressively on improving the quality of pedestrian environments throughout our state. And that's what we're talking about here. If you want to improve access to transit, one of the best ways to do that, at least in these kinds of spaces, is to improve the pedestrian connections. And so with a greater participation by our state DOT, I think they're leading the way. And as I mentioned already, MPOs are already in this space. I think what we're excited about is that the data from these studies will help support, I think, a desire on the part of these agencies to move ahead. I think one of the things that has hampered them in the past is the lack of quantitative effectiveness measures. And so we're hoping that we've at least started the conversation, started the process of providing those measures that will lead to greater investment from state DOTs and MPOs.
All right, so maybe to step away from the questions just for a second, because it struck me the beginning of your report and the story behind how the research project started. And then maybe, because we're now, you're now talking about, Utah's Department of Transportation. So I am wondering, they had already started doing some bus stop improvements, was my understanding. And now you've worked on this project and in order to collect this data and to further support it. Can you just sort of talk about that?
Yeah, if you've read the report that we produced for NITC on this, there is I think probably a kind of hokey personal story about a former student of mine that I met on the street who was working for UTA at the time. And he was on a street in my neighborhood. I was walking to work, and there he is with his orange vest and his hard hat with a crew, and they were improving a bus stop. They were taking it, as I said in the presentation, from a pole in a puddle to a stop with a concrete pad and a shelter, etc. And I looked down the street and I saw other crews going, just kind of marching the way into downtown, doing similar things. And he said the agency, this would have been in 2014, that they were starting to make targeted investments in corridors instead of just kind of dispersing what little funds they had allocated for stop improvements to, kind of the four winds of the transit service area. They were concentrating them in corridors, and that got me thinking. I thought, well, that's kind of, you know, innovative, and maybe that would result in greater impacts in ridership or customer comfort. And I asked him if he was collecting data, and he said no. And then later that day, we started this project. And that's an element of the study that we really still, ironically, have not cracked yet. And part of it is because we just don't have enough data to be able to answer whether improvements along corridors is more effective in moving, the overall ridership numbers than dispersing stop improvement funds more broadly. We need a bigger data set to be able to answer that question. So I guess the research question we started with, we still haven't answered it. We've answered a lot of other questions along the way.
That's great. So yeah, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to do my best to sort of group them. But yeah, we have a question on how you measured the paratransit data related to stops.
Well, all the paratransit data, I'm just correcting my email address as I talk here, because I realized that if you use that email address, you won't find me. There's my correct email address. All the paratransit data come from the transit agency. They have geocoded data on all pickup and drop-off locations for every paratransit trip. And so we were able to get the geocoded coordinates for all of those trips. We focused on the origin ends of the trips, the pickup locations. And using GIS, we put all of those locations onto a map, and then we created buffers around all of the stops that we are studying, both control group and treatment group. And the buffers were quarter-mile, as we call it, network distance. So it wasn't, the circle as the crow flies kind of distance. These are quarter miles using the street network. And those trips that had a pickup location within those quarter-mile buffers were included. Those are the trips that we studied.
All right, so now sort of talk about the facilities. So you discussed the facility and the different components. How did you, like, is there any sort of idea of what should be part of the facility and what gives you the best bang for the buck? Or is that sort of I believe it's $14,000 cost, is that sort of the bare bones? And also there's just a little additional thing that you didn't mention about safety and lighting.
Yeah, we were interested in trying to get a more or less dichotomous assessment of whether you had no facilities or at least kind of the bare bones basic facilities. And we could not, with this data, segregate out, Is a shelter more important, or a bench more important, or a trash can? Maybe it's all trash cans, but I doubt it. Or is it the concrete pad? And for ADA purposes, that's the most important. This was another reason why we started the work in 2014, is because UTA not only was making targeted improvements on a corridor basis, that's also the date that they started more or less to routinize what an improved bus stop looked like. Before that time period, and I'm speaking generally, but before that time period, a bus stop improvements were kind of one-off. And so here it might be a bench, there it might be a shelter, there it might be something else. And what happened in 2014 is they basically standardized the improvement package to include the 4 things that we were focused on. And that made it a lot easier. So we didn't have to tease out, okay, well, this was just a bench that they put in here. Is that enough? Do we see any results from that? It was kind of, if they were going to touch a stop, they were going to do these 4 things and not much more. These are not Cadillac bus stops, not like the one that I showed in Korea with the heated seats. Safety is going to be an important factor, and lighting is going to be an important part of that. We didn't measure that. Everything that you can do to increase the comfort and security of a potential rider is going to be important, but we didn't measure it.
Okay. So there is the question about how this research is informing project selection for UTA. Has this led to stop improvement prioritization scheme or increased funding to enhance the bus stops?
I haven't. I used to sit on the UTA board of trustees, and I no longer do. And I haven't been tracking their budget for the past several years since the results of the study came out. And they've been kind of dribbling out. We had some, as I mentioned in the presentation, a paired stop analysis that had some results, some impressive results, if I may assert, a couple of years ago. I think this is still coming out. I mean, this final report that the webinar is focused on. It was just published by NITC, weeks ago, and so it's still too soon to say how much impact this particular research is having. However, the agency has been moving pretty aggressively towards making investments in bus service. And after a period of impressive but somewhat controversial improvements on rail, they are now pretty evenly focused on bus, with with a preference for bus services. Certainly that's where the political movement is shifting right now, is to make improvements to bus networks. And so that, of course, involves more than just the stops themselves, but the stops are included in that. And the agency's on the cusp of issuing a new set of guidelines on making bus stop improvements, and we're pleased to see that, and we think maybe we've had a role in that. It was just 2016 that they did a detailed inventory that we referenced in our research of their bus stops, and categorized them using at least 20 different types of variables. And that database that students in our program helped to create was one of the kind of the layers that we used in our research, and I think it reflects a increased interest by the agency in making bus stop improvements and making bus service a more positive thing for people in our region.
Great. Yeah, I think you hit on a number of questions there. So I heard a number of answers to some of these questions about variables and such. I guess one of the things that jumps out to me is what do you, I mean, I know it's not your responsibility and your involvement's limited, but Do you know what they're looking to sort of define where they want to go?
UTA meaning?
Yes.
I don't. It, the push a couple of years ago, and I think this is still a priority for the agency, is to try to fill in the network. That was a famous or kind of a catchy line that they used, that we had created this armature of rail investments, 150 miles of rail transit constructed in about 15 years. And that the focus of the future for the agency for the next little while was going to be to fill in that armature with smaller grain services, including a lot of bus service. And I think that's still where they're headed. I think that's still what they're trying to do. But like I said, since I stepped off the board, I've mainly been focused on what I do at the university and not as much on what UTA is prioritizing for its budget these days.
We have a question earlier about data on feedback satisfaction on the use of the new bus stop facilities.
Yeah, so that's another part of the study that I didn't cover in our presentation, and that is doing qualitative research. So one of the grants that we got for this study funded actually a variety of different qualitative measures, and we hosted a couple of focus groups of ADA paratransit users, and then did a series of interviews with transit patrons, with service providers, with advocacy, accessibility advocates. And the results from those efforts are in the final report. They're provisional in that we were just getting started with all this data collection before the pandemic hit, and it's hard to do qualitative interview and focus group based research during a pandemic. And so we're starting to find ways to get beyond those limitations. But what we did find before we essentially had to shut things down for a while was that at least among the disability community, that the improvements were appreciated and were part of a kind of a suite of priorities that they wanted to see the agency pursue. So I think the suggestions that we saw from some of the survey data that I presented at the beginning of the presentation were confirmed by our focus group participants and interview subjects.
Great. So we have a question that seems about one specific issue. I'm not sure, but I'll see if we can get an answer from you, Keith. ADA paratransit's 3/4 mile deviation was put in place due to accessibility to bus stops not being guaranteed. Do you envision a possible scenario whereby certain streets, blocks being formally certified as being ADA compliant would negate that 3/4 mile requirement?
I can't anticipate that, and I don't think that's what it's certainly not what motivates our research, and I don't think that's what motivates the transit agencies, at least the ones we've been working with. They do now, at least in Utah, have a home stop analysis that is looking at things like the nature of the closest bus stop, and that is a factor in assessing ADA eligibility, and it can influence on whether a particular patron achieves conditional eligibility status or complete eligibility status. And as a researcher, I'm excited to see that because I think that's a much more holistic approach. We were just, looking at such a narrow slice of what the transit experience is for a lot of people, just the stop itself. And as that photo from the UDOT headquarters shows, it's a lot more than just the stop. It's, can you get to the stop? And in a lot of places, getting to the stop is problematic for people because of the lack of other types of infrastructure. So having a more holistic assessment when looking at ADA eligibility, paratransit eligibility, I think is headed in the right direction. I would hope, however, that those kinds of assessments would help inform investment strategies by transit and transportation agencies as much as they determine eligibility.
Great. All right. So I think we have about all of our questions addressed. Let's see. If you have any questions, you can submit them now. We have a couple of minutes. Keith, is there anything you'd like to address?
Well, this was a fun project for us. Like I said, it was one of those things that just kind of fell out of the sky. Hadn't thought about doing something like this, but we in at least planning academia, we spend a lot of time talking about high technology and high cost approaches to solving transportation problems. For a long time, it's the focus has been on rail transit, and now in recent years, it has been on new technologies, particularly those associated with automated vehicles and connected vehicles. And this project was fun because it was kind of countercultural, if you will, focusing on kind of low tech and low cost improvements to ask the question is, does it make a difference in making the investments in these low tech, low cost solutions? Is that meaningful for the lives of actual users? And we were pleased to see that it, at least a measured answer to that is yeah. It seems to make a difference. And it makes a difference, I think, in ways that are more profound, at least initially, than these higher tech solutions. I mean, depending on who you read, the sidewalk was invented in the 17th century. And yet, by my estimate, only about half of the street miles in the United States have sidewalks. And so a technology that is 4 centuries old is still only partially deployed in many of our communities. And yet we're moving on to these, kind of new toys, these new very shiny objects and new high-tech solutions to solve transportation problems when we still haven't completely deployed the old technology. And so I think this is a moment to stop and say, maybe while we don't want to shut down new technologies, certainly, but we also should be aware of how that can sometimes, that the flashiness of those new technologies can sometimes divert our attention to such an extent that we forget to make investments in the basics. And so this research project was a shout out to the basics, I guess.
That's great. Can you just touch on for a moment how you think this can be done in some other communities? Maybe what you've seen?
I'm glad you mentioned that. Our report has an appendix that we call the cookbook. One of the limitations of our study is that this was just about the UTA service area. And that's, I think the data and the results are defensible within that region, within this region, but it doesn't say anything about how these associations might play out in other regions with other conditions. And so we're really eager to see the approach that we've taken, or a better approach, please, to be applied in other regions with other data. And so what we did for that appendix is we kind of went step by step by step by step of how we did what we did, with the hope that it would leave crumbs that other people could follow to create their own analysis or own research project for their own regions. Now, granted, what we provided in the appendix is a bit cryptic. We didn't have a lot of time to provide full English sentences in describing what we did, and that maybe is an unfinished part of our work. And so if you go there and you look at that appendix, you may say, what the heck is this? Be in touch. We'd be happy to talk you through it, and also if we have the opportunity to go and make a more kind of full-throated prose description of our efforts.
That's great. Yeah, we definitely encourage the audience to go to the NITC project page. I shared it in the chat at the beginning of the presentation. There's a lot of resources here specifically on Keith's project. And then we have all these other events coming up, the Friday transportation seminars and webinars. Our research projects have slowed down, but we're very hopeful that we're going to be publishing several new reports in the next couple months, and probably have a very interesting spring full of presentations and events. So please continue to attend our webinars and our seminars. Keith, I want to thank you a lot.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. This has been a kind of a kick in the pants kind of project, and it's fun. It's fun to report on it. So thank you.
Great. So for anyone who's wondering, you will get an email with the slides, Keith's slides, and the presentation will be posted via YouTube. Yeah, so thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.